Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Sean, join the chat. Okay, so there's just the two of us here.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I just started early just to make sure there was no wobbles. But so what I can do is
figure it out.
I'm going to mute myself. Hi, Brian. This is Alex. Can you hear me okay? Oh, you're muted. Are you able to see the chat window?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Excellent. Thank you. Just want to make sure that we're not broadcasting mute.
So are we using your mic then on your laptop?
Nope. I just want to make sure mine works. Can you hear Sean?
Yes.
Brian, no, we cannot hear you. Am I muted? Oh, there we go.
Okay. It's not important that you hear me.
Not yet, but when there are questions, maybe.
Okay.
Perfect.
I can ping him in Slack though. I guess technically we work together, even though I never really spoken with him.
Oh, there you go. Okay, and you should be seeing MetaCPAN, Modulicious, and OpenAPI.
Yes.
Perfect. As I was saying to Case, after 18 months of doing this, I think I just about got the technical end of this down. Yeah, 18.
Well, they're changing everything underneath you. Right?
Well, I'm a smart guy. I should be able to figure it out, but it's just mental block. And my God, what was the URL? And use the right browser.
So we're just waiting for a few other people to come.
Yeah.
They have to be led into the building.
Right. People coming up from the lobby. And then as soon as that shipment of people arrive, I think we can get going. All right. This is great because, am I still muted? No, I'm not still muted. In previous versions of this meeting, I'd be fiddling and futzing with the technical answer, 15, 20, which is pretty boring to people.
Gotta make sure I get the right.
This is an interesting combination.
I actually quite like pineapple with hot peppers.
I
Are
love
these
pineapple hot peppers.
pickled onions, are they on there? It's adding a bit of a different twist to it.
For me, the sweetness balances nicely with the heat of the peppers. Those are terrible things to put on pizza.
Most people, when you tell them, they think it's crazy to do pineapple and hot peppers. But
Yeah.
it's a good
To me,
mix.
oh, that's okay.
Well, then again, some people think putting pineapple on is sacrilegious, so they've got to get past that first. And is anyone else on the Hangout? Is Foco there?
No, I'm surprised Foco's not there, actually. I'm actually a little surprised because he's a pretty regular attendee.
Jim isn't on yet either, right?
Oh, there we go. Hello.
Pizza and beer.
Oh, pile of people. Wow, Indy, long time no see. Hiya.
How you doing?
Good. All right, folks, grab a seat, grab some pizza, and we'll get rolling here.
Is everything good with the sound? Yes.
Yep,
Yes.
thank you.
We think. I haven't unmuted yet, so we'll see what happens then.
Right. He mutes again.
So I just actually, okay, Foco was active 58 minutes ago, so he's not online right now. I just sent him a note.
Yeah, it has a lot of hot peppers. So hot peppers and jalapenos and pineapple.
Good for the system.
It is good. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, I'm not a pineapple on the pizza guy, but the hot and sweet together on the pizza is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
But as you say, the onions make it a little different. It's good.
Do you expect anybody else? Or is everybody here? Check the meetup.
Let me check the meetup.
There was 10 listed, but some of those might be remote.
Sachin's listed, but he's in India, and it's like
I'm guessing.
it's 8 in the morning, so he's not going to be attending. Mark Perry, I guess he's going to be remoting in. Yeah, Foco signed up, but he's not here. That's it. Dave, who presented last month, has said he was coming, but he's not here. Maybe he's. Oh no, you're right there.
He's right here. I was going to say, wait a second.
Wait a minute.
That was my twin.
I'm pretty sure I was here for that. I remember seeing you present.
All right, we're all here. Take it away.
All right. All right, can you hear me okay? Echo, yep. I think we killed the echo now. If they can hear me all right, I'll get going.
Well, speak up and find out.
Can you hear Sean, Brian?
Gotta say something, Sean.
All right.
I've said a
Yes.
couple.
Brian can hear us.
How much other do I need to say? All right, so this talk is MetaCPAN, Modulicious, and OpenAPI. During this past November, I attended MetaHack 3 to work on MetaCPAN. And during it, Joel Berger and I worked on documenting the MetaCPAN API using OpenAPI. If you haven't heard of OpenAPI before, the specification originated under the name Swagger, and they renamed Swagger to OpenAPI to separate the tooling for OpenAPI versus the API specification itself, OpenAPI. So the Swagger tooling set is open source, so you can use it, but we chose not to. We're writing from scratch. We did it in Vim, and I'm going to explain all of that.
Cool.
And not only documenting the API, we in turn started using this for validation and routing to drive the API calls as well. So in effect, you end up with what becomes one source of truth for your API, and that's your open API spec. It documents, routes, validations, and does the responses, as I said. So there are discovery tools as part of the Swagger bundle. Again, we chose to write this in Vim because that's what you do. You write things in Vim. And some of the tools that we used, the OpenAPI map. This is a website hosted on GitHub. It's interactive, and you can click on each of the nodes, and it'll actually tell you what inside of the OpenAPI specification is acceptable at that level. And I have a demo that I'll step through at the end that'll show this a little more, just giving an overview of what this does. This is very helpful when you're writing this stuff out, so you know where to put what. Redoc creates an interactive page providing the documentation and examples based on your OpenAPI spec. This website is an example of theirs. You can go on and see their spec, but this is what comes with Redoc. And this is all the documentation for a Fictionary pet store API. And I'll show you the MetaCPAN one as well. We use the Modulicious plugin OpenAPI. It's written by Jan Henning Thorson. It reads the OpenAPI specification and adds the appropriate routes automatically to Modulicious. So there's the amount of coding you have to do inside of Modulicious is greatly reduced. And I will show that.
So it reads a spec and writes some code?
It reads your spec.
It reads your
spec
spec
and writes some code.
and handles all the routing and validation and formatting responses, handling errors. It does a lot. Wow. JSON validator is hooked into the Modulicious plugin API, and this is used for that validation of the input and output. And it also validates that you've written the spec correctly. When you go to start up Modulicious, if your spec is wrong, it just bombs out, and it'll tell you where it is, how to fix it. So get started. Redoc. Setting up Redoc is pretty simple. They give you a HTML template that's seen here, and you serve this statically, and the only thing that you need to change is the Redoc tag, and that's at the very bottom, and spec URL is the attribute you need to set. That points at where your spec file is on the server. So when you hit this page, it'll read that in and then build all that documentation for you.
Is redoc a valid HTML tag, or where did that come from?
It's an extension in their JavaScript. So you actually load on, the script tag for the source gives you the redoc JavaScript that goes through and parses the HTML, figures out what the redoc does, then goes and reads the YAML and create YAML or JSON. I'll get into that.
Okay.
And then displays it. So the open API specification file is pretty simple, but it can get to be quite long. And I'm going to break it into small pieces so that way it's easier to demonstrate. It is a big YAML file, potentially, so it's easier to read this way. As I said, you can choose either JSON or YAML. We chose YAML because multi-line attribute values in YAML are really easy to use, and it makes it a lot easier to read and less formatting. And I don't know if anybody's used multi-line inside of YAML, but it's amazing how useful it is. Basically, it's a here doc inside of YAML. So to start off, we define the version of the Open API spec we're going to use. I know I said that the specification was renamed to Open API from Swagger, but version 2 of the specification still calls the version Swagger, so you have to call out the Swagger.
Historical reasons.
Yeah. Version 3, you use Open API instead. Okay. I'll say, and I can't remember if I included this later, but I'll say it now. We chose 2 because 3 wasn't fully baked at that point in time. There were still little adjustments being made to the specification, and 2 is what was there and valid at the point in time, so proceeded with 2. You provide some general information about the API, the version, a title, and then there's a common shared, the base path is a common shared path that's used throughout the API. So in this instance, we chose V1. All of our API calls are prefixed with
Right, so
/V1.
version 1 of the API.
Yeah. Okay, to define an endpoint, the configuration of the API paths are contained in a section named after the URL path to access them. So that's just a long way of saying that if your API is in /search/web, you create a section of YAML /search/web, remembering that we have a base path, so it's V1 /search/web, but we don't have to repeat it.
Yeah.
You just put it in place. Underneath the path, you give the HTTP method that the endpoint accepts. There can be more than one. In this instance, we're doing a simple GET. The operation ID is a unique identifier throughout the specification. It doesn't matter what it is, but something relevant is nice. Now, this is an extension attribute, and this is used by Modulicious. This attribute points to the name and class in the application, or sorry, the class in the application and the method that it's going to call when you reach this endpoint. So in this case, it's search, and inside the search class, we're accessing web method. And then you can give documentation as to what is expected at this, what this endpoint does. The fun part, we're adding the parameters that the API expects. These are all of the parameters that Meta CPAN Search Web accepts, but I'm going to break it down because it's just way too big to read. So you have your parameters class that explains what it is that it's going to accept, and it's an array of objects. In this instance, the parameter name is Q, and I give it the location of where you can find the parameter. And in this instance, it's query. You can also include header parameters, or path, form data, or body. So it's quite powerful, and you can mix and match as well. So I can say, you know, the queue parameter is in the query, but the user ID and password or authentication is in the header. And
Is that the multi-line syntax of YAML then?
that is the multi-line syntax of the YAML.
Is there a terminator for it? Or
The terminator is the next parameter.
the starting is always a bar, is it?
Yes, that's your indicator for multi-line. And you can have spaces, and those space are like blank lines, and those blank lines are interpreted into the Open API spec, and when they're displayed in the description, you will get paragraphs.
Oh, neat.
Whereas if this were JSON, this would be one big long line, and then you'd have to put formatting inside of it if you wanted it. But
I like it.
yeah, the YAML looks quite nice. Okay, and then we're going to document the types of value that the API accepts. In this instance, we're accepting a string. The different values that are acceptable are array, boolean, integer, number, null, object, string. And the required attribute does what it says, whether you require this parameter or not. Not going to step through all of them because you're just repeating them over and over again, but this is how you define the response object. The response attribute contains objects keyed on the HTTP response code or a keyword of default. So the response code is identified by the HTTP status. So in this case, it's a 200. When the API is going to respond with a 200, this is what our response is going to look like. And it's the schema that identifies that, and the type that I'm giving it here is an object. And then I give it the properties of the object of what it's going to return. And the schema can return either objects, primitives, or arrays. Sorry.
Seems very unperlish to have such tight specifications of type.
Yeah, it is. But it's quite nice because when you do contact the API, it will validate against those types.
Ah, so it sounds like it's used a lot for validation.
Yes. And when you do, yeah, it goes both ways. And so when the documentation is made up, because this is a response, the documentation will tell whoever the consumer is going to be that this is what you're expecting and these are the types. So if that person is using Golang or some other strongly typed language, they know what they need to consume. And then there is a catch-all that, you know, type object, and you can just tell it anything. Inside of the MetaCPAN spec, items is a list. And it's a list of every one of the responses. By giving a type object means I don't have to go through and define what everything's going to be. This could be left to a later date for someone else to define, or as the spec grows, you can make these changes. You can also define error conditions. And I'll admit this right off the bat. I copied this right out of the spec repository because they're HTTP errors and they're always going to be the same. So if something happens, a 500 error, it'll be expressed in this format. You can break them down, so you can do a 403 and give, you know, a different description or whatnot. But this is the catch-all. So up until now, we've been defining the API spec and just documenting what it is we're going to create and what it is we're going to tell people back. So now we're going to hook in Mojolicious. Additions to the Mojolicious application is adding the Open API plugin and configuring the plugin. And that's basically pointing the URL attribute to where my spec is.
And then the magic happens.
And then the magic happens. Inside the controller, and this is the actual controller for the search web interface for MetaCPAN. There is not a lot of code. This is the search web definition I showed earlier. It really doesn't do a lot. But the OpenAPI sections are, this line here validates the parameters against the specification. So whatever I'm called with, am I getting valid input? And if it's not, it returns undef, which gets turned into a proper error with documentation as to what that error message is. And then if it is, it continues on, and you extract the arguments out of the valid input. So there's a simple hash ref of all of the parameters that have been in by name.
Can I ask you to step back and just tell me what Modulicious is, or Mojo even?
It's a platform for routing requests.
Building web applications.
So just call some callbacks based on.
It's like Catalyst or
Catalyst and Dancer.
Dancer, another web application framework.
So OpenAPI is all run over HTTP requests.
As we've gone down this line, Dancer has a plugin that does something similar to this. Catalyst does not. In order for us to integrate, MetaCPAN is a Catalyst application as it stands right now. In order for us to do this inside of MetaCPAN, we would have to write an adapter for Catalyst when Modulicious already had all of this. So we've actually bootstrapped Catalyst inside of Modulicious to do OpenAPI. It's pretty cool. All right, we extracted, and now we have the parameters, we can do the work. So queue, from, size, these are all attributes that we care about when doing the search. And then we simply send back our results as JSON. It's not very complicated, I don't think, to be able to render a full API response.
Yeah, for someone who's used Modulicious, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
If you haven't used it before, then requires a bit of reading and learning about Modulicious, but that is fairly standard.
So would it basically work that you use Modulicious and it will just simply call your functions like web from internally without you having to worry about the structure and how you call?
Normally you would define, the routes. And there's, in the application.
Like how does that function web get called?
Right, so normally in this application, you have the sub startup, and in there you would actually set up all of the routes that Modulicious is gonna be able to call, and so you'd put your paths in here, and then you'd say, okay, when this path comes in with this HTTP, or its HTTP method path, go to this controller. And so rather than having to do all of that coding, we've put it in the OpenAPI spec, and then this plugin consumes the spec and sets up all those routes for me.
Basically, your application, when you run it, is going to listen on port in that web server. So it's going to listen on port 80, and it's going to accept requests, HTTP requests. It'll look at the path and do the routing, like Sean said. So it'll look at the path and says, I have to call this function. And it's going to generate a response for me that I can send back to them.
Okay. And that functional web, is that the one that was used there? Was that one of the callback type of functions then?
Yes.
Okay.
It's in the search controller, and it's the web, and that's the one we defined in the spec. So there's a little more advanced definitions than you can get into, and these are things I didn't know going in, and it was nice. Joel was able to point these out to me. You can actually use $ref as a relative pointer to include definition. It's a JSON reference, but YAML understands JSON, and so we can use ref to point to a file, and then inside of that file you can use hash to point to a section in that file. So this allows me to break out results for the search items into another file to keep things more organized than having one huge YAML file. And for error definitions, it's very useful because every one of your request methods is going to need responses, and they're going to need errors. So you create one error section, they're all defined there, and you just point to them. So that's what this line is doing. It's pointing out my error model, and my error model is the one that I showed you before. There are some gotchas. Part of the reason you end up repeating yourself because of the way the ref spec was working inside of the YAML. It can only exist on certain parts of lines. It's weird, and I'm doing a poor job of explaining it because it's one of those things that when you run it against your spec, you'll see the error message, you go, oh, I can't put that here, so I need to take and add in. And I don't have an example, unfortunately. But if you're using the version 3 spec, you don't have to worry about it because it corrected all those problems. And then you can actually, instead of having only file references, you can use HTTP references and keep your YAML elsewhere. The other thing is might be null. There are times when your properties are not going to have a value that you're taking in. In the MetaCPAN API, the favorite count may either be an integer representing how many people have favorited a distribution package or null. If you change the type attribute into a list, then it'll evaluate to any of those types that are within the list. So that's where you can throw the null on the end there and say, okay, if I have a value, it's an integer. It has to be an integer, but I can also accept no value at all and still be valid.
That's more Perlish now.
Yeah. So some words of advice of some things that I learned while doing this. Start small. The spec doesn't have to include everything as you get going. We started with the Search Web API, and that is available for people to get now and start reading from MetaCPAN and using it through the Open API spec while we work on doing the other sections of the API. So as I said, we started with the search endpoints, and in some places, yeah, I used object as a valid response file because I didn't have the time to go through and document all of the properties of what can be responded with. But this gets us going. I can always come back and add them later. The important part is getting started. Organization, I struggled with this a lot because, as we all know, the hard thing in programming is naming things and off by one errors. So trying to figure out which file all of these parameters should go in and who should be able to talk to what, and it got overwhelming, and it finally just became, you know what, start writing the spec, put it where you think it should go for now, and if we think it needs to go somewhere else later, just move it. The API itself is static, but the specification contents themselves can evolve over time.
Is this code that exists on MetaCPAN?
Yes.
And who are the customers? Who are the users? Who's using it?
MetaCPAN itself uses it because there is the web interface talks to the API over the API specification for everything that it displays. I run Alfred app on my laptop, which allows me to call up a search bar and I can start typing in MetaCPAN Perl modules through MetaCPAN, and it'll go and fetch the names from there using the type ahead lookup. So anybody who's using the API, and there are a number of things that do use the API, has access to this. You can use it for your own things too.
It's public.
Yeah, completely public. Now we're just working on documenting it so that other people can understand what's going on, rather than just being the people who work on it. All right. There is some further reading. Like I said, the MetaCPAN spec file is part of the GitHub repo, and you can go on to GitHub and have a look at the API itself. This is the API specification. The documentation is available online. The Open API specification repository is excellent. It has a lot of examples, and it actually starts off small and builds upon it. And it's that pet store that I showed you before. They have that all online, and they show you, here's an example in one file. Now here's an example of breaking it out into 10 files. So it's very helpful that way. Redoc for the documentation itself. I do have time for a demo. This went a lot faster. So let me get out of this. Need to find this one. I was doing some work on the train. So give me a second to get set up. All right. So this is the MetaCPAN API GitHub page that I was discussing. And that's the standard API documentation. Isn't much. But MetaCPAN firewall. Static. So you can see here, this is the actual API file, and we have the paths defined for search web and search first, and they are using references to call out to separate documents to be able to call those in. This is where, I'm still trying to figure out exactly the file layout I want to use for these things. That's the full search with responses. I actually have more of the API on my laptop that I'm going to show, just because I've done some more stuff with it. So this is the Open API map that I was showing earlier, and said this is the interactive site where you can go on and see what is in the specification. Okay, so I switched over to version 2 to match what it is that I've implemented. If you click on the Open API, it tells you everything that's at the top layer of the API. Paths, and so a path can be either named the path or an X attribute. And then you see in here that, yes, you can call out to a reference, or any one of these HTTP methods is acceptable, and parameters. And as you click in, it gets more and more detailed, which is nice. Tags that can be applied, a summary for the method, a description. You can point out to external docs. Schemes property. And this is where you define the parameters that it's going to accept, and it tells you everything. So if you're writing your Open API spec, I keep this open all the time as I'm working on it. So this is, as I said, I'm running this locally off a Docker container right now because I've made some changes that haven't been published yet. I need to figure out a solution to Elasticsearch fixtures that are breaking. But if you go to MetaCPAN and you call up static index, you will get something similar. It's just lacking the coverage. So in here, there are two different documentation points. One is search, one is coverage. And this is the search web API. And this is all the text that I entered into the API spec that's available here. And you can see this was the YAML here doc with a paragraph break in it. So it does section it out. It does accept formatting in Markdown as well. So that's why you get the formatting collapsed. And then it gives an example of what the response would look like on a 200.
Except it doesn't know what the results look like because it's just an object.
And I have to,
Oh, does that?
yeah, that one we actually documented out.
Nice.
Oh, I didn't know the Leafs were playing tonight. I was wondering what they were playing.
So you mean you don't have to write that example? That's
That's it. Yeah, it's
This all
taken
comes from the documentation.
directly from the spec.
Which means it's not going to lie. It's documentation.
Documentation is lies.
Just like comments in code.
Yeah.
And because you're using it as your code to drive it, your code is in line exactly with the documentation.
It's amazing.
And then we've all, well, I don't know if we've all, but you know the I'm feeling lucky button and you just hit and search it. Well, it's a separate API call. It accepts one parameter. What am I going to search for? And then this is what the response looks like. And there's nothing extra underneath of it. So if we call the API, this is the autocomplete suggestion that I was talking about. If we call it with moose, this is what we get back. It's a list of distributions that contain the word moose for autocompletion. If anybody have a favorite module that they...
Or tiny.
Tiny? Let's see if it works. Oh, no, Tiny. I don't have all of MetaCPAN on there.
I want Acme.
Oh, yeah.
There's a couple acronyms in there. Neil has done work on MetaCPAN, so that's why his modules got included.
Ah.
we for development, we only take a subset. We can actually, because of the way it works, we can use the actual API to do our development as well. But the stuff I want to play with is more system level, so I want Docker containers to deal with it. The other one is, this is the web search. So this is the result when looking for moo. Collapse this down. Oh. So if I can ask it to search for moose, get a little bit better, a little different, and Olaf, he might have something to do with MetaCPAN. So his modules are in here too. Okay, so this is the search API and page again. And this allows us, in this example, I'm using, let's go back here, the collapsed parameter. And collapsed has a type of Boolean. And I've given it the value of blah. So now when I do that, I get the error message back that it's expecting a Boolean and it got a string. And this is the path that was called, and the status code that gets assigned.
Are all parameters on a web URI strings anyway? Even the word true?
They are, but it has to pass validation. So now the real question is, one is true.
True.
0 is false.
How's 0, 0?
3. So it's not truthy.
0E0. This is some of the fun
Oh.
terms used.
0, 0. No. Oops.
False with a cap.
0,
Cases.
0. Oh. Let's see if we can break it. Oh. Huh?
Doesn't like false. Interesting. Isn't it like true?
It liked
With a
true.
capital F, it doesn't like it.
What are the
False
capital T?
lowercase.
False lowercase is fine.
Oh,
It's
okay.
capital true.
Which is interesting though, because URLs are not supposed to be case specific.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say.
Parameters are,
True.
not the URL itself, but the parameters are.
Yeah, I agree.
So that is simply, that's that one line call to validate, and that's what it returns on its own.
So speaking of validation, does it also write tests? Like test more test cases?
No.
You could probably run the OpenAPI test suite, the Modulicious OpenAPI plugin test suite to say that, yes.
It validates,
Yeah.
but it doesn't actually go out and say, okay, well, I've told you that this is a Boolean, now I'm going to pass you.
But you shouldn't have to write validation tests in your test suite because OpenAPI is guaranteed to do the validation correctly if its test suite passes correctly.
Yeah, I'm just thinking belt and suspenders.
But you'll have to write tests to make sure that it's returning the correct values. That the response structure should be okay. You shouldn't have to test for the response structure because OpenAPI deals with that, and its test should cover that it is able to handle all the different types of structures and things like that.
Yeah.
So if you use the telnet session and type that in, is that the text you'll get back? Or is this being parsed?
This is being parsed by Firefox to display JSON pretty.
Just do a view source.
So you'll get a block of JSON.
Well,
I think all in one line.
That's what you get back.
Yeah, there you go.
That's raw data coming right back from.
What is an error 400? What HTML or HTTP?
Where is bad data, is it?
All I know is you screwed up.
404 is not found.
Yeah, everybody knows what 404 is.
bad data.
So with 400, can you just return information just as like a full web page as well, if you wanted to?
You can return whatever you want with a 400 status. And the browser will generally ignore it and display its own.
It's bad request.
Bad requests.
Can you do that even with a 302? I don't know, with a 302.
Well, you
302
can
is
send
moving.
anything you want, but depending on the browser on the other hand, and
Browser
how they
won't display
interpret
a
it,
302.
no, they won't. They'll follow there should be a location header along with the 302. If there isn't, it'll display its own error saying it was a bad request or something. Returning something because the 302 didn't have direct location. But the browser is pretty free to do what it wants. And I think you used to have to do little tricks where if it would ignore what you sent back as the status information or as the body, unless it was big enough. If it was big enough, it would display it. So sometimes you'd have to just pad it with extra data, and it would say, okay, they must be providing something useful. So that's how you get the 404 fancy pages with images and all sorts of stuff on when you're browsing the website.
So 404 can return a full HTML page
Full
saying
yeah.
why
Absolutely.
what you want.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
But the API always returns JSON.
Yes.
If you've ever gotten a 404 on GitHub, there's a cool little thing that says, this is not the page you're looking for. And it's a little piece of art made up of like Star Wars looking stuff. Right? These are not the droids you're looking for. This is not the page you're looking for. Goofy stuff.
So I put this up if anyone's interested in the slides, because generally,
Excellent.
as per usual, my slides are very code dense and there's a lot to read if you're into it. So it's available there to have a look at with notes.
Fantastic.
If anybody has any questions, I might be able to answer something.
What is readout?
Uh,
Very stupid.
oh no,
I don't know.
Redoc is a tool for the reading. Hold on, I'm going to snag the URL here and I'll put it up there. Oh, so Redoc is the JSON library that reads, sorry, the JavaScript library that reads the spec file and creates this web page.
This is sort of like a pod interpreter. But with this
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's pretty good. It takes your spec file and generates documentation out of it.
Yeah.
So Redoc takes a YAML file and
Makes it a pretty web page so that you can scroll
I'm
through
just
it.
impressed that people are still using YAML. I just imagine that faded into obscurity.
No,
years
it's
ago.
quite prominent now.
Really?
Yes, and there was a big conversation happened around the Golang community because they've been using TOML, I guess TUML, is a new markup type language that for configuration files and whatnot, data representation. It's kind of like the Microsoft window config files with the square brackets around your sections and name equals value. It's kind of like that. And people were upset and wanted to use YAML, so even the author of TUML said, you know what, I give up, let's just use YAML. And then everyone complained that, no, but I'm using this already. So he had to come back and he has to start supporting it again. And, but
They're such prima donnas, these programmers.
Is it that thing that Emu does?
he was a member of it, but yes.
I think, yeah, YAML is like an INGI from the crazy mind of INGI.net.
But YAML now is what drives Docker, it drives Kubernetes, it drives Terraform, I think, is 2 in 1. It's a weird configuration.
Wow.
Ansible.
Ansible is YAML.
Because it's easy to read. And it's like JSON became really big for doing a lot of things, but it has those limitations of structure where some things are just impossible to do and it becomes ugly. And YAML is easy to read. It's not XML, which is its strongest point. And yeah, and it's still easily machine readable as well. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you structure the document and still make it easier to flow through and read it.
Oh, and Brian says YAML is really popular. He's seen it heavily used in Java environments as well.
Yeah.
I like it. I didn't know they use it more.
It's easy to write. Now, I do find it very clear. XML is just too damn wordy. I don't want to deal with
Too many
it.
tags getting in the way.
Yeah.
Angle brackets.
Yeah, it's so gigantic. You want to save a little thing and boom, there's a 1 or 2K file.
More structured than data.
Hmm?
More structured than data.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I find JSON is just too unstructured.
Yeah.
Like I said, that here doc is amazing to be able to use inside of it.
It's very easy to do arrays or key value pairs if you want to. It's very natural to do. Indenting is your depth level, which is what everybody uses to do.
It's like Python.
There are a lot of extensions to YAML as well, because I tend to think back to the original specification of how things work. And I've been working a lot with Docker environments lately, and being able to reuse sections of YAML from one part of a document in another part it does actually exist in the YAML specification, though it's kind of on the outside, but it's been on the outside for like 10 years, and so people are using it. It's acceptable.
So XPath,
It's really, let me set it up and I'll show you.
I just reinvented Markdown for myself. I didn't like Markdown.
Actually, I don't think I have an example.
I don't know. I think YAML's a little bit different from Markdown as well. Markdown, you're trying to pretty up your data. I guess you're still trying to structure it, but give it meaning.
You want text that looks, you want the HTML to look like the original text more or less without any structure to it. But there are some times where you do need to add additional data that you can't put in text, like logos and images and alternative text for a say logo. Then it starts to look.
It does start to look messy.
Okay, so what do you have here?
I don't have an example of reusing sections of YAML further on. This is the MetaCPAN Docker definition to create a Docker container running MetaCPAN API.
You mentioned how you can set this all up locally. MetaCPAN is kind of designed to allow you to hack on it, right?
Yeah, I'm still working on it, so I don't want to promote that you can do this. But it is available, as Kay said. In the MetaCPAN Docker. So there is a MetaCPAN Docker repository that allows you to run the full stack with Docker Compose on your laptop. Or wherever.
Can you just connect to the MetaCPAN.org site instead of just running the same?
Yeah, but if you're hacking on it and you're doing work for like rewriting the web interface or this stuff that I've been doing, I don't want to, or I can't do it to MetaCPAN directly because someone has to approve the changes I make before they make it out there. This allows me to deal with that locally.
You just want to use the API for your own projects.
Yeah.
Use it, but if you want to add something to MetaCPAN itself,
Right.
you can run it all
Just
over
using
it.
Yeah, as a consumer, you can start using it.
I don't think there's any limitations on it. It says there's a be nice on the API docs, right?
Yeah.
So don't hammer it.
But it's driving all of the traffic now because searchcpan.org shut down, redirects to MetaCPAN.
Tell me why. Is there a reason behind that?
The people, my understanding, the people supporting search.cpan.org didn't have the time to support it.
They weren't accepting additions or changes,
Yeah.
so it was very difficult to add or improve what was there. They no longer wanted to support it, so they were shutting it down.
Yeah, in fact, I think isn't search.cpan gone now?
It is. It redirects to MetaCPAN.
Yeah.
And in almost all ways, MetaCPAN is better, except for some of the ways that the actual search happened. That's the only reason that people were upset about it, is because the terms you typed in, you get different results out of MetaCPAN. Originally out of search.cpan, because it had a different algorithm for doing searching. But for everything else, you get way more information from MetaCPAN. It's, I find it a much nicer interface as well. So
That's another one of the consumers of the API, grep CPAN.
Grep CPAN. That's cool.
Yeah.
And the best thing about it is open for you to view all the source code, how it's all implemented, and you can contribute if you want to. Whereas, when is the last time you saw a change on search.cpan? It's been there for 20 years, and I don't think I remember ever seeing a change.
I never knew I wanted to change.
It did its job, and it did it well. It certainly did. But
I used to search for a module. Show me the module. That's all I wanted.
Just do anything.
so what are some things that CPAN or MetaCPAN have? I think it shows reverse dependencies, doesn't it?
Oh, let's do this one.
So you can see what module to use this module.
Canadian? What?
That happened in,
Chicago,
was it Chicago?
2006.
What's it all about, hey?
We were at dinner and there was too many Canadians at the table. And at the table, I think he wrote this module, and that evening he pushed it up the CPAN.
We're
Too
in the
many Canadians at the
Very
table.
good, yeah. And all this module does is instead of ending your code with a semicolon, you can put a question mark. Yeah. So it just changes your line terminator.
Always
There's
good
a
fun.
replacement for die. That's sorry.
Sorry. That's a good idea, actually.
Yeah.
That would be a good addition to this.
No, so we should update.
We should update that.
The file does not exist. Sorry, eh? It's funny.
Yeah, I use viewing the source and browsing the source a lot. And that's that.
Great. Very interesting.
There's a lot to the spec. There's a lot more than I've shown because this would get really dense, and I tried not to keep it so dense.
Are you aware of any other projects or companies that are using this to develop APIs?
Yes.
None that I can talk about. Okay.
Swagger isn't a Perl thing, right?
No, and
So-
it's not even just a JavaScript thing. So it is widely used. I do know other companies that are using it, but can't go into
That's fine.
details
Of course,
there.
of
But
course.
yes, it is widely
Your
used.
single word answer was enough. Okay.
One thing I will, these are called tags, and they're extremely useful in separating stuff up, and that's part of the OpenAI
Yeah,
specification.
yeah.
It'll explain it. But
Comment from Brian here that he was looking at this about 8 months back, but never had time to dive into it for his current job, which is interesting. It does look pretty complicated for somebody who's wants to spend like a couple of hours a week working on some project to get into. But it's very interesting to be able to start with documentation and have that generate stuff. It's usually what happens is you write some code and you go back and you go, I have to write the documentation. And then
Yeah, my situation, I was told.
you added some. So it's very neat.
Brian actually works.
Yeah. So in my situation,
Oh, right.
I was told I had 2 days to come up with a way to
Right.
document our REST API. At which point I knew I couldn't do it this way, which I felt was the right way, using OpenAPI spec to document our REST API.
yeah, maybe in Pittsburgh.
Well, you need a VPN to connect to that?
Yeah, it's my home. And I can bring up the VPN.
Yeah.
Because on a kind of a side note, but related, I am writing from scratch a new API based on OpenAPI and Modulicious. Right now, I'm working on the authentication layer, and let's search this out. So there's actually a plugin that allows you to, now this is the written in JSON, that allows you to add security directly into the OpenAPI specification. So you can say, this line here, what it's saying is in order for it to enter this path, it has to pass the security definition dummy, which this is the security definition of dummy, and where to find it. So this, you would have your JWT, JSON Web Token. You'd include that with a header authorization and a value, and we could actually authenticate. Yeah, authenticate. And you can get it, you're allowed into that section of the API.
How does this open API interact with things like user sessions, right? That would be does it work with them, or do you have to put them inside your API request? Or is it?
That's probably a plugin that's part of that you can add to your Modulicious app. Probably a module.
Well, typically, the way I would do it is with a JSON Web Token. So the first thing you do is you'd authenticate. You'd send your user ID and password as part of the API, and it would send you back a token. And that token is encrypted, and it contains, well, it contains whatever you want it to, but generally you include the user ID of the person who's been validated, and it's signed. So if anything happens to it, it breaks, and it's not a valid token anymore. So it's secure as well. And then every time you make that API request, you're passing that token back.
Now there's different ways of passing tokens.
You can.
Very weak understanding of this. Some of it can go through cookies. Some of it can go through actual data in your
There's two ways I know of. There's the cookie method, and there's adding it to the URL. So every request you make includes your token with the URL.
With an API, because it's code making request, you can as a header as well, which as a request header. So have authorization as your header, and whatever the token is. Then it doesn't show up in your URL, which means it doesn't show up in your logs.
Right.
That's kind of a clean way to hide away from your data that you're sending up.
Yeah. So for instance, I'm doing a lot of API work, so I include the token and the username and the API token in the header. So I make my user agent, I stuff that information in there, and then I make the request. And if you can see the request going out, and there it is, but the actual authentication is part of the header, so it's not as visible.
And JSON Web Tokens is another spec, isn't it? It's another standard, a standardized way of handling authorization tokens, which is, there's probably another Modulicious plugin to be able to decode those and generate those for you.
Yeah.
So can you guys remind me what the header would be? I don't know what the header is, but what would be the data in the header? Would it be the specific?
Well, I think it's key value pairs.
You can put whatever you want in headers. It's just the server on the other end needs to know what to do with them. So if the server is expecting an authorization header and it wants an encrypted JSON Web Token in there, then you have to provide it in the.
And what if it's a cookie? Then? Do they have a different structure, or they just follow the same thing?
There's standard HTTP request headers for cookies. So you would provide a cookie header with properly formatted cookie.
Did Leaf score?
No.
Yeah, so that's another standard, but that's part of the HTTP standard. There's
Ryan has typed a fairly long question here.
Headers, and there's cookie response headers as well. So the server can send a cookie back to set it, and you have to send it back the next time.
So the header can contain cookies or any arbitrary data that you want. And the data can also go in the data part of the URL.
The payload, the body.
Well, there's a body plus there's a URL.
Yeah, so the URL itself you can put stuff in, and the body for a post, if you're posting it, that can be put in the body. Although even with a GET request, you can pass a body as well.
Would all these be posts then generally in this particular?
It could be a post.
If it's not a post, then it would just be a whole bunch of stuff on the URL.
A post is like an insert. Put is like an update. From a REST API point of view.
These are all gets, and all of the parameters are
gets like a select.
That can get quite long.
Yes,
but it's search parameters, so
yeah.
It's not massive. But if you controlled the client and the server, you could put all of your information in headers. So you could create a header called address and then fill in your address there, and the server could interpret that. I'm looking for the address header. Oh, here's the information I want. It's not a good way to do it, but it's completely arbitrary. You can make whatever headers you want.
No, I'm just trying to understand best practice.
Yeah.
I think some of the commercial signal sign-on products also put their own request header. So basically, it'll go in and it'll talk to some particular. It may redirect you to some place, and it'll redirect you back, and it'll put something in the header and caches of what is valid, so it doesn't have to go to the server.
Yeah, you don't have to
keep things in
re-authenticate.
in the header properties, groups of how long it's good for.
The regular web browser, you wouldn't use different headers generally. The web browser doesn't. That's why the web browser uses cookies. If you're writing an application that talks to an API, you have a lot more control over what happens. Managing cookies is a bit of a pain there, because adding a header is very straightforward. So with API calls, you often use the headers for authentication, whereas with web browser, you use cookies.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Except
With an application like a single page web app, you would store the authentication token in local storage. And then the web browser would use that for every API call that.
but it's again an API call.
Yeah, it's an API call that's going on. It's not a web call.
So that you're kind of running an application in web
In browser.
Right.
that is able to, your application can inject the headers.
And that's a little different than a
Yeah.
browser session. Like if you go somewhere and log in,
Yeah, I
You'll get a
guess
cookie
under the
back.
context I'm talking of is a web browser. You have a page of.
yeah, so
if you-
web
now
browser,
You have to
you
somehow.
log in, you get a cookie back, and then every subsequent request you make to that domain, the browser includes your cookie.
It will do that automatically.
It does it automatically.
So that would be the way to do the session ID.
Yeah, and that's just going to be a 48-byte string of gibberish, which doesn't mean anything to anyone. It's maybe a UUID or something like that. But at the other end, it'll look you up and using the UUID and say, "Oh, right, that's Indy. He just logged himself in 3 minutes ago. This is fine. So we know who you are. We know you're authenticated. And maybe the session will last for half an hour or an hour or 5 minutes or however long, or forever."
Or he spent 5 minutes on this page as an ad for snow blowers, so perhaps we should have him tracked someone to give ads for snow blowers.
So there's a question from Brian. He was informed to be cautious to use this to document a pre-existing API, and it's usually better to start with the open API before writing your API. I've gone down the other route, and he wants to know if there were any issues or do we have to be extra careful going through MetaCPAN code when developing the spec. And the answer is yes, we had to be very careful as the spec was being developed. We did all of the work locally. There is, I prefer Docker, but there is a VM image that you can download for MetaCPAN as well and run it inside of, what's that VM? Not VMware, the other one. VirtualBox, thank you. I always forget that. So you can run it in VirtualBox and run your local MetaCPAN. That's what we were doing. We were running it there. We created the site locally. We tested the site through our browser to make sure everything still worked. And then we ran the full test suite going through the same routes. And what we actually did was rewrite the tests that Catalyst was using to do Modulicious calls. Not to put a bias on it, but the Modulicious tests were actually using the web front end to come in, so it was a little bit better of a test in the end to make sure that we were getting all the results correct. And then because we bootstrapped the Catalyst app inside of Modulicious, if anything went wrong, we could shut down the Modulicious app and bring up Catalyst right away. without incurring much of an outage. So there was all kinds of contingency, and we actually broke MetaCPAN for about an hour and a half while rolling this out.
Oh, you know, if you don't break things in production once in a while, you're not trying.
Well, and the fun thing was this was Sunday afternoon, just after lunch, and Olaf and I were getting on a plane at 3 o'clock, and we had an outage for an hour and a half, and trying to get this deployed. Pretty much a Friday night environment.
That's a pretty exciting.
Yeah. And so we're in the airport with our laptops out going, okay, is everything still running? Are we okay to get on the plane? I said, yeah, looks good. Okay, get on the plane.
I know how to broke the web yesterday. Fixed it this one pop. Not rest until it's working.
Yeah.
I guess making live changes to your YAML file is not recommended. Break that YAML file, and your application is going to fail. It won't parse. And
Yeah.
it's not just that one thing you were editing that's going to fail. It's the whole API that will stop working. That as well, your routes are
So
what are the issues of using a Docker container for your development versus MetaCPAN? Does MetaCPAN itself, is it a Docker itself or not?
not yet. Working on it.
So what would be the reason for you using a Docker container versus a virtual machine, let's say?
Virtual machines.
You said somebody has a virtual machine release of
Right.
this thing as well.
So the difference between virtual machines and Docker is a virtual machine emulates the CPU and its associated controllers
Yeah.
to simulate a PC. Docker is just supplying part of the kernel. So it's a lot lighter.
So I understand the concept of the VM and the Docker itself, but just the pros and cons. Why would I choose one versus the other?
It's a lot lighter.
You chose Docker, for example.
Yeah.
For me, I've not used Docker before, and I use lots of virtual machines all over the place. If I had a virtual machine image, that'd be easy for me. But am I going about it the wrong way?
Well, no, if it works for you, you're good. But for me, the virtual machine images are generally 600, 400 gig or 400 meg range.
Right.
You know, they're big files to deal with. The Docker images are tiny.
How big are they?
Depending on what you're doing, some of them are like 20 meg. The definition is a YAML file, and then it downloads the images it needs, and it only downloads them one time. So they're pretty quick.
So if you build a Docker partition, I don't know what you call it, on your own machine,
Mhm.
it needs Apache version X and Perl version X.
Yeah, and I've got a.
The definition can be very small. It still has to get the pieces from somewhere. How does that happen?
That's part of the Docker definition as to where the images come from. This gets into a whole Docker conversation. So you can see at the top here, so we have services, and each of these services defines each of the containers that are going to be created. One of the containers is web, the next one down is API, and the next one down would be Elasticsearch, YAML, indented, right? So underneath web, we're using an image called MetaCPAN web, and we want the latest version. So this is looking in my local container to figure out what that image is, and it'll have an image for it, and it'll run that image. Now, I have another Docker file that generates that image for me.
So if you need, like I said, Apache version X and Perl version X, it's got to go and fetch something at some point. But then it really becomes just like as big as
No, because I don't need an operating system.
Well, actually, just need Apache.
I just need Apache.
How big is Linux though?
Wow, it depends on.
For a virtual machine, you give it, you tell them how much disk space you want to use. And so it needs libc and all of that stuff, and all the supporting libraries need to be there. It's not just Linux itself, it's all the other things around it. It needs to boot, whereas Docker comes up very quickly.
Where does the file system for the Docker just shared, just uses your normal file system?
Yes. On Linux, on Mac OS is a little different, and it's screwy, and
Doesn't it actually have a virtual machine?
it has a virtual machine. It is actually running a Linux box inside a virtual box that you run Docker containers through, and
I think I still like to be on there.
Yeah.
If you want to run Docker, you still need a Linux machine, and then you need a virtual machine, a virtual box on top of that.
No.
Anyway,
if you have Linux, you
On a
run it
Mac.
straight. On a Mac, you have to have a
But
virtual.
only one. So if you want two applications that run on different servers, you would need two virtual machines. Whereas on the Mac, you need one virtual machine. that
my
runs the two
development
applications.
environment typically is Windows anyways, because I'm just developing that, so typically a virtual machine seems like something I would need anyway. I want the Linux environment.
Okay. Yes.
Interesting.
So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 containers running for MetaCPen here.
Docker allows you to better replicate a production environment where you have a database server here, you have a web server here, or you might have 5 web servers, you have a load balancer here, and they can all be in separate Docker containers on separate networks, and they communicate over each other. So it replicates an environment much better than running 7 virtual machines where you run out of memory. You can't.
Okay, so it's way more lightweight.
It's way more
Way
lightweight, but it still contains
But-
them separately.
And that's an important distinction. You talked about replicating production environment. To me, that's gold. I mean, you can fiddle around with some, one VM talking to one more VM, but if your production environment is much more complicated, you want to get like what you said, load balance from 5 web servers.
And the web servers you can't talk directly to the web server. You have to go through the load balancer. You can't talk to the database server at all unless you come from a web server. All of that is containable within Docker environment.
But if you're developing an application, that may not be important to you.
Yeah.
But for someone who's managing the systems or ensuring that it runs, or running a test suite, that may be more important. We're seeing that at work now, where we can push our tests up to a system that runs Docker images on AWS. And push your tests up, or you push your code up and it automatically tests it for you. It runs as many tests as you want. Gives you a result afterwards while you continue the program.
So in order to put Docker images on the Linux machines, you have to have some sort of like base code, right? Something that Docker images load into.
The Docker package,
You just have to install it.
apt-get Docker. Speaking of the networks, these are all the networks I have running for MetaCPen because you don't get to talk to them all. Now, this image actually, so the MetaCPen web will talk to the database over the Docker network, and they're assigned their own private networking addresses. But I've actually mapped the database to the local 5432 port, so that way I can use Postgres client and talk to them. That I'm going to change as well. This is a slow process. Mostly because the time spent developing MetaCPen is all volunteer time.
Yeah.
And get to it. That's what makes things like MetaHack and Perl2 chain. So
If you want to install version X of say Perl inside of Docker,
there's Perl images.
do you just define the Docker?
Yeah.
Or with and say it needs Perl X, or do you run apt-get Perl like you would on a normal Linux machine?
I think because someone has built packages for you, you can just use them. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
With Docker. Build Perl for you.
One from column A, one from column B.
Would you pick and choose like Alan from a menu of I want a Perl, I want an Apache, and put them into your Docker?
Or write a config file.
This is the config file here. This is a Docker file. So you can see here, this is the image that it's going to come from, and it's coming from the Perl 522 image. And this exists on Docker Hub.
Okay.
And that's where everybody puts their images to be able to share. So yeah, you'd go there and you'd say, I want from Apache : latest, and now they get you the newest Apache running inside.
So that Perl 522 is not a Docker image, it's just a
It is a
component that
Docker
goes
image.
into a Docker.
No, it's a Docker image. So this will be, I'm going to guess it's Alpine Linux. Alpine Linux is one of the smallest Linux distributions there is. It's built for containers. You can run it as a desktop too, I've seen. But
Doesn't a Docker contain multiple things? Like, let's say Perl plus, let's say you have Python.
you can if you want, and that would be a new image that you would build. Right. Typically, your Docker containers are small,
Are they
single
focused on
purpose.
just doing one thing?
Yeah.
It's just Perl, or it's just Apache, or it's just
But
Postgres?
just Perl would be pretty useful. Wouldn't you want to say Perl plus database as well?
No, you have a
No,
database container that you talk to.
Perl will be running your application, your script, whatever.
Yeah.
The database will be running the database, and the database guy would have an address, a network address, and the Perl guy would talk to the network address, talk to the database over the network address.
In production, you would probably have those on separate machines as well.
Exactly. So you wouldn't have, normally when you think of developing something, you've got everything in one place. You've got the web server, the database, you're developing code, it's all in one
So where
machine.
would your files go? Like text files, let's say you have some text files that you're processing in Perl, then making some connections to your database.
Well, the text file might live on the
Perl,
one that's got Perl on it, sure.
And then let's say you need Python, you want to do some of the processing in Python. Then you put those in.
That'd be a separate container.
Yeah.
But how is it going to access those text files that are in Perl?
This is getting into a whole Docker, and I can do a whole presentation on
You
Docker.
You know what,
but
here's a solution. You probably have another Docker that would have a shared file system.
Yeah.
And the Perl guy would write to the shared file system, and you tell the Python guy, oh, go and read the file, and it would go to the shared file system. And do whatever it's going to do.
like here we have a volume definition of
Yeah.
/carton. And the reason this exists is so that way, once you run carton once and download all the CPAN modules that it takes to run Meta CPAN, which I said is a Catalyst application, so there's a lot of them, you don't want to do it again. So it creates a volume on your host computer. So on my laptop, there's a directory for carton, and it writes all of those files there.
Okay.
So when I take the container away, those still exist. I bring the container back, it just reuses them.
Okay, so this is a shared volume of file
Yeah.
directory system
Mhm.
that's shared by multiple.
It can be.
Okay.
And I have one of those for my database as well. So that way when the container goes away in my database, I
Doesn't
don't
go away.
lose it all.
Yeah.
Right? I have persistent storage.
Because they're small and they have a specific purpose, they're very easy to share. Whereas a virtual machine that has a lot of stuff in it, you've got to send a large file to them. And then if you make changes, you want to upgrade module, you've got to send the whole image again, or they have to update their own. Docker, that's a config file change, and they don't have to download a huge image to get those changes.
Well, in my case, I would just use the virtual file system. The virtual machine, I would just share a shared file. Share.
You'd share them out, exactly.
I think the sharing you're talking
I'm
about is
talking
me
about-
sharing it with you.
Yeah. Do you want to hack on this? It's, like what CPAN has here. If you want to work with CPAN, you can download their virtual image, but won't get the latest updates because they haven't regenerated their virtual image. They might do that a couple of times a year to generate a new virtual machine with all the latest stuff.
Yeah.
So you either have to keep it up to date yourself, whereas with Docker, you would basically just do a git pull to get the latest Docker config files, and then you could bring down all your Docker images and bring them up, and now you have all the latest Apache that was needed and new version of Perl, and all of that is there without having to download a 600 meg image that is already a few months out of date because they haven't regenerated. So it's easier to share stuff with other people when you have these small little self-contained systems. That are
The last time I was
driven-
involved in the Meta CPAN project, they were using Vagrant.
Vagrant is a way of generating, virtual machines. So you can,
It was a little challenging to get going.
Yeah, because you vagrant up, and then you have to run
Yeah.
Puppet to provision it, and it does. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
there were a lot of-
install,
There was,
CentOS
yeah, it was
install.
quite complicated. And I felt more stupid as I went along because it's, oh my God, there's another thing.
This here, I'm using it. I think Olaf is using this as
Mhm.
well now. We're looking to make this into actually how we deliver Meta CPAN, so that we won't have
Deliver
servers.
to production.
Yeah, to production is all going to be Docker containers, Kubernetes at some point in time as well. But you can see here what this is doing. It's copying up the CPAN file and the CPAN file snapshot. And then when we carton exec, it's going to say, oh, well, I don't have any of these modules. And it's going to go through the CPAN file.snapshot and install everything that's needed. So it's always up to date with our source code.
Cool.
I just let everyone else set all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I run a command and I get Docker images everywhere.
Very
It's-
cool.
It's really flexible and configurable, but it's not necessarily easy to set all this up. Once you work with it for a while, I think it becomes easier. There's quite a bit figuring all of this.
Yeah.
But there's quite a bit for people to install an OS and then set up a web server and do all of that as well. So, or create a vagrant file to do that for you. So it's a different way of doing the same thing, virtual machines versus containers in the cloud become very powerful. We can just push out a bunch of containers onto different systems.
That part I understand, but that's the real struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, to
Yeah, that's astonishingly powerful.
deployment is the part that really gets.
Press the button and all these things spring into life. That's pretty awesome.
And that's what we're doing with testing now. So you write your code, you push it out, and it just launches it on some AWS servers. It provisions all these Docker images, so you get a clean setup every time based on the latest whatever is in there. And it runs all your tests, and it gives you a report back afterwards saying these are the test failures. It's amazing how productive you can be when you
Yeah.
just sit there and wait for a half an hour for all your tests to finish. It just comes back at some point.
Asynchronously.
It's an asynchronous test.
The really cool thing is we have an implementation of Jenkins on another project, and what that's done is it's created a big beefy Jenkins box.
Mhm.
And so you have this constantly running Jenkins box that however much it costs to host it.
Yeah.
The project we're using now uses a small little, it was a T2 micro to control everything. And when it needs to run tests, it spins up these massive AWS boxes. And if Case pushes a test and I push a test, it just spins up more of them, runs the tests, and they all shut down. Last night there was 140 instances running.
They were migrating from one Git repo to another. It brought over a ton of branches, and it saw, oh, this is a new branch, I got to test it. Here's another new branch, I got to test it.
Just went
So it just fired off all of them at once, and AWS didn't run other systems. It just spun up as many as were needed, ran the tests, and it all.
It's amazing what it can do.
God.
But another project we're on, we use containers as virtual systems, much like you would use Vagrant for VirtualBox. And we use Ansible to deploy to each of those boxes. So the container itself is an Ubuntu image, rather than being just a Apache or just a Perl. It's an actual Ubuntu operating system. So the container is a little bigger. But then Ansible goes out and does the install. of
Docker,
that.
So it's-
VA, and Ubuntu image.
You just from Ubuntu latest, and it'll pull down all of Ubuntu as a container.
That's a virtual, that's a machine on its own.
But it doesn't replicate the hardware.
No.
So
But with Ubuntu, you're getting a lot of stuff, and maybe you don't need all that stuff. So to my mind, Docker is really just, let's just focus on getting this one little guy to do one thing really, really well. And that's all it does. Web server, so it's only a web server. There's no database stuff. There's nothing else. It's just
I'm
a
not
web server.
totally convinced of that concept. This Ubuntu image is not what that.
No,
no,
but that-
that will probably have Apache and it probably will have
It does.
Python, it will have PHP, you know.
Yeah.
A few other thing.
Well, it's,
Perl.
you
You'll have
it's,
Perl
do you get,
technical.
do you get one big thing that does everything, or do you get a couple of small things that are specialized?
That's an interesting question.
It depends on
Let's figure that out.
well, it depends on what you're using it for too. Like the project that I'm describing where it's Ubuntu is we're using it to test that Ansible works. So we have boxes, we have a database server and another database server and multiple web servers. So I want to simulate that environment on my laptop. Well, Docker is a lot lighter than running 5 Vagrant box or virtual boxes. So I can bring those 5 containers up and I can deploy Ansible to them relatively easily. And my laptop thinks nothing of it. Like I said, I got 5, maybe 7, whatever Docker containers running now, and my CPU is very low. But if
How
I
much memory?
16 gig. But if I were to bring up 5 virtual boxes, it would grind to a halt.
Give each 4 gigs of RAM. The other thing with the virtual machine is if you run that virtual machine out, it's going to take up more disk space, which means it's more expensive. But even if it's not doing a lot, it's a bigger image that you have to put up there, which means
I'm
it's
convinced.
going to cost
I
more.
understand.
But it doesn't mean that virtual machines aren't useful. It's a different task. It's a different job.
Well, like I said, it's a virtual machine that's running Linux to run Docker.
Excellent.
I'm going to stop sharing now.
Right?
I keep messing up. I'm looking at my mouse on the shared screen when that's my mouse. I'm wondering why it's going so slowly. All right, I'm muting. So
Good question. When I was talking to Olaf earlier this month, he said, well, we don't have to have a talk. We can have a hackathon instead.
Olaf won't be here.
What's that?
Olaf won't be here.
Yeah, that wasn't necessarily to say that he would be here. It was more to say, oh, we could have a hackathon.
I've already.
What I find useful is to have discussions like we just had the last
Yeah.
20 minutes, which is where I like to ask questions, because there's a lot of things I want to ask and find out.
Mhm.
So I need to-
Well, perhaps what I could recommend is maybe ask on the mailing list, and maybe for March we can have a bit of a discussion about the different VMs. And I mean, the last ones I used was Vagrant, but actually before that I wrote code that would create the VMDKs from Microsoft. What the heck were they called? Anyway, VirtualBox, VMs, and the begins with an E, I think. Anyway, there's a whole family of virtual machines. And Kubernetes, if I'm pronouncing that, Kubernetes, is some way of shepherding a bunch of Docker images. Anyway, it'd be interesting just to go through all the
What is a 5-minute talks that they do? Like,
lightning talks.
What I'm thinking it would be useful is to have a reverse lightning talk, lightning question.
Lightning questions.
That's what I would love to have
All right.
more often. I would have a whole bunch of.
I'll make it.
They're
I'll make
small. They
a.
don't deserve a talk or a topic on that.
Yeah.
I don't want somebody to give a half-hour presentation on questions that I have. I just need a 5-minute answer.
Well, if it's an interesting technical discussion, let's have the technical discussion. That's what this group is all about. And eating
We do that
pizza.
at the pub sometimes too.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I
All right.
second that idea too.
Oh, Fulco was about to say something and I missed it.
I second that idea too.
Ah, there you go, folks.
All right.
Are you actually going to come in here though?
No, I gave up that one time during the mega snowstorm where it took me 2.5 hours to drive in.
Yeah.
I just do the train. I can't be bothered to drive into Toronto.
All right. So March will be container extravaganza, and we'll see what happens. I'll build more structure into it, and maybe everybody can have a turn doing a little mini presentation.
Yeah, I'll bring something.
Cool. Okay, Volko, thanks for coming out. See you next month, I hope.
Yupper.